As I'm sure many of you already know, there was a controversy over Cardinal Cupich and the Archdiocese of Chicago planning to give pro-abortion politician Dick Durbin a Lifetime Achievement Award because of his stance on immigration policy. Durbin's own bishop, Bishop Paprocki, publicly and strongly spoke out against giving Durbin the award, and Pope Leo was asked about it and also commented on it. Fortunately for everyone, Durbin decided to decline the award, but I think there are still some important lessons for faithful Catholics to learn from this scandalous controversy. First and foremost, we need to pray for our church leaders from the top down, that God will give them clarity and prudence to know the right course of action, as well as the zeal and courage to do it. Second, the church from the top down needs to rediscover its own teachings with respect to the hierarchy of political and moral truths and evils. In the Bible, we read that some commandments are weightier and greater than others, and that some sins are weightier and greater than others. These biblical truths are echoed in the patristic writings too, and they are relevant for the topic of this video. Catholics especially should know better than anyone that there is a hierarchy of gravity when it comes to moral and political truths and evils. Catholics should know there's a difference between grave sins or evils and venial sins. And so the same principle applies with political issues and evils. Pope St. John Paul the Great approved a doctrinal note in 2002 written by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict. And in it, it says there are moral principles that do not admit of exception, moral principles which are fundamental and inalienable, such that it is morally impossible for Christians to promote laws that violate those principles. This document specifically calls out the right to life from the moment of conception as one such principle. Notably, no mention is made here of immigration policy or the death penalty with respect to such non-negotiable principles. But in a confidential memo that was later leaked, Cardinal Ratzinger, as head of the CDF, explicitly says that not all moral issues have the same weight as abortion and euthanasia, and that there may be a legitimate diversity of opinion among Catholics on the application of the death penalty or waging war. It's important to point out that, regardless of its initially confidential nature, direction and guidance from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, or the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, as I believe it's called now, it always carries a lot of weight, especially when headed by a future pope. In 2006, Pope Benedict XVI reaffirmed what was taught under his predecessor about the principal focus of the Catholic Church's interventions in the public arena, namely principles which are non-negotiable, such as the right to life. No mention, again, was made of immigration or the death penalty in this 2006 address. Unlike the issues of abortion, euthanasia, marriage, and educational freedom, we see the Catechism treats immigration policy implicitly but clearly as a matter of prudential judgment, not something involving non-negotiable intrinsic evils. The obligation to welcome the foreigner is conditioned upon the ability of a more prosperous nation to do so. And I have to ask, how many people know that the United States is $37.5 trillion in debt? That's an incomprehensibly large number, and that's just the federal government, not state and local government debt. And I'm not sure why people think the devastating consequences of that debt will never come home to roost. Does that sound like a country with the ability to take on the financial civic burden of more immigrants from third world countries? Anyway, the Catechism goes on to say that political authorities have to take into account the common good, not just the good of immigrants, and thus may regulate immigration, placing conditions upon it, and that immigrants are obligated to obey the country's laws and help carry civic burdens. So this is the teaching of the Church, that immigration policy is not on the same moral level as abortion policy, and that immigration policy is a matter of prudence, whereas abortion is one of principle. And what has the Church traditionally said about her own competence and mission when it comes to matters of prudential judgment? Pope Paul VI, in his apostolic letter commemorating the 80th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, said that the economic, political, and social issues vary widely from nation to nation. And so not only is it difficult for the Church to put forward a solution which has universal validity, but it is also not the mission of the papacy or church leadership generally to come up with such solutions. Rather than popes and bishops, Christian communities, including and especially the laity, must do the difficult analysis of the situations in their own countries and prudently apply the principles of the gospel and the Church's teaching to their specific situations. On the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, Pope St. John Paul the Great published an encyclical in which he reaffirmed that pastors, which would include popes, bishops, and parish pastors, cannot pass definitive judgments on political, economic, and social current events, which is not the Church's domain and responsibility. The Church has no political or economic models to present. It's not the Church's responsibility to necessarily confront concrete problems in all their social, economic, political, and cultural aspects, and the complicated interactions of those aspects with each other, as is certainly the case for immigration policy, and perhaps to some extent capital punishment. Of course, the social teaching of the Church is an indispensable and ideal orientation in terms of principles and goals, but not in terms of specific political and economic models or policies. In his 2009 encyclical Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI reaffirmed the teachings of Popes Paul VI and John Paul II, saying the Church does not have technical solutions to offer and thus does not claim to interfere in any way in the politics of states. To wrap up the relevant Church teaching, it is important for everyone to understand what scandal is in the technical sense used by the Church. The church is not merely talking about the stuff of tabloids or shocking immoral behavior. It is specifically referring to statements, behavior, or example that leads others astray, that leads others into error or sin, even if unintentionally. And scandal can take on a particular gravity based on the authority of those who cause the scandal, including those in political or church offices. Jesus has very strong words against those who cause scandal. The Catechism also says they are guilty of scandal who establish laws or social structures leading to the decline of morals or that make Christian conduct and obedience to the commandments difficult. People in positions of power who lead others to do wrong or believe wrongly are guilty of scandal. So let's keep all this in mind as we turn to the recent specific controversy. With all that context in mind of the Church's teaching on the hierarchy of non-negotiable moral truths versus matters of prudential judgment that are outside the Church's definitive and authoritative domain and mission, let's now analyze the statements and actions of current church leaders involved in this Durbin controversy and measure them up against those church teachings. Now, soon after Durbin declined the award, Cardinal Cupich released a statement defending himself and his rationale for giving Durbin the award. I find it interesting how Cupich's defense never mentions the name or character of the award as a Lifetime Achievement Award. He claims that the award was to be specifically in recognition of Durbin's supposedly singular contribution to immigration reform. But I don't think that's the impression a reasonable person would get from an award for lifetime achievement. Next, Cupich goes on to complain about how there are essentially no Catholic public officials who consistently pursue the essential elements of Catholic social teaching. I don't understand the point he's trying to make here. Is Cupich under some obligation to give out any lifetime achievement awards to anyone or to any public official? No, he's not. Better to give out no awards than to give one to a Catholic who doesn't deserve it and who scandalizes others with his support for abortion. Lastly, Cupich defends himself by saying he was hoping the award would have been an invitation to Durbin to ponder why the Church defends the vulnerable on the border between life and death, as in cases of abortion. Are we supposed to take this seriously? The expectation that giving such an award would do any good, or relatively more good, in opening up Durbin or other politicians to the pro-life position, rather than scandalize the faithful and undermine Catholic teaching against abortion, this all seems naive and imprudent at best. Surely the Church has more precise and prudent tools in its toolbox than public lifetime achievement awards to open up pro-abortion politicians to the pro-life position. To Cardinal Cupich's credit, his statement does reaffirm the Church's teaching on abortion. But then he also talks as if it were the fault of the faithful and their divisiveness, rather than his own fault that controversy erupted. Frankly, I think he needs a good, long, hard look in the mirror, and he needs to take the church's teaching on the grave harm of scandal more seriously. And it's not just me. Bishop Paprocki is an example of a prudent and courageous leader in this controversy. Unfortunately, I believe we will need more faithful, prudent, zealous, and courageous bishops to fraternally correct their brother bishops or even cardinals in the future. It's even likely that the church would have benefited from similar fraternal episcopal corrections in the past. Now, in his article in First Things, Bishop Paprocki points out that Durbin's support for abortion is so extreme that he voted against the Partial Birth Abortion Ban Act, which bans the gruesome procedure in which a child's skull is punctured with a pair of scissors and its brains sucked out with a vacuum. Durbin also voted against the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which would require life-saving medical care for any child who happened to survive a failed abortion. Bishop Paprocki takes the sin and harm of scandal seriously and rightly points out the inevitable, foreseeable, and grave scandal that the award would have given. Paprocki also boldly states that Cardinal Cupich knows that Senator Durbin has not been permitted to receive Holy Communion in the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois since 2004. And remember, Bishop Paprocki is the bishop for Senator Dick Durbin. Now, make this make sense for me. Why would Cardinal Cupich give an award to a Catholic who he should not even be giving Holy Communion to? Bishop Paprocki also rightly points out that Cardinal Cupich did not even follow the policies of his own archdiocese and that of the USCCB. This is embarrassing for Cardinal Cupich. It's worth pointing out that the preamble to the policy states that, quote, even if these individuals or organizations do not address these specific topics of dissent at the facility or event, their appearance is a source of scandal and confusion, end quote. It's a great policy and very clear, and it includes speaking appearances and opportunities, not just honors and awards. It does not give any wiggle room for giving an award to a pro-abortion politician merely because a Catholic entity agrees with and likes his immigration policy stances. Interestingly, as just mentioned, the guidance and policy of the USCCB and Archdiocese of Chicago do not give any wiggle room for giving an honor or award to a pro-abortion politician merely because a Catholic entity agrees with and likes his policy stance on other issues like immigration. Now, at first, I was thinking that maybe it wouldn't be such a scandal if, rather than a Lifetime Achievement Award, the award had been tailored to immigration or some other single issue, like the USCCB and many dioceses do with annual pro-life awards that they give out. But reading those policies and guidance has me thinking there would still be grave scandal even in that scenario. And it also begs the question, should the church even be giving awards out to anyone based on their stances or activism on a matter of prudential judgment, such as immigration? Pope Leo's remarks on this controversy were frankly disappointing, lacking in sufficient clarity and prudence, and even somewhat scandalous, as I've personally experienced in having to answer questions and clear up confusion from my own fellow brothers in Christ at my parish. Of course, Pope Leo was responding off the cuff to an on-the-spot question from a reporter, so we should cut the Holy Father a little slack because of that. And we should recognize that such statements, under those conditions, have perhaps the lowest level of magisterial authority possible, if any at all. Regardless, it's important that knowledgeable and faithful Catholics provide clarity, even when the confusion is unintentionally caused by the Pope. Now, I'm not going to go through every statement he made. I'd encourage you to watch the full Vatican News video for yourself. But I think it was a mistake for the Pope to give the impression that the Church teaches that abortion, the death penalty, and immigration policy all have the same moral status or gravity. The impression that the death penalty and immigration policy are also non-negotiables. Maybe the Pope didn't intend to give that impression, but I think a reasonable person could walk away hearing that and getting that impression. But as we've seen, that is not what the Church has taught. If support for abortion disqualifies a politician like Durbin from receiving communion, it clearly disqualifies him from a Catholic award for lifetime achievement, no matter what other good he has allegedly done. We don't need to look at his whole record or overall work if one fundamental grave thing disqualifies him. Moreover, while I agree that the Church's teaching on each of these issues is clear enough to the person who examines the Church's magisterial documents, especially those documents under Popes John Paul the Great and Benedict the 16th, as I've tried to do in this video, I'm not sure that the Church's teachings are clear enough in the sense of what the average Catholic parishioner believes about Church teaching on these issues, especially the death penalty and immigration. I think we have to frankly admit that there was a lack of clarity under Pope Francis. And we're only 5 months into Pope Leo's pontificate. So let's pray for Pope Leo and all our shepherds, that God may give them all the wisdom, prudence, and courage to teach faithfully and clearly. Now, this wouldn't be the first time in church history that a pope, a successor of Peter, has unintentionally given scandal. I did a whole video examining St. Paul's rebuke of St. Peter as recorded in Galatians 2. I'd encourage you to check that out, as it provides helpful lessons for dealing with today's controversies in the church and the papacy specifically. I hope this video has clarified church teaching for you and shown you how they apply to the recent controversy involving Senator Durbin, Cardinal Cupich, and even Pope Leo. Again, first and foremost, I ask you to join me in praying for our church leaders from the top down, that God will give them the clarity and prudence to know the right course of action as well as the zeal and courage to do it. But let me know, what did you think of this video? Tell me down in the comment section. Even if you disagree, if you found some value in this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Thanks, and God bless.